I'm King Link, and today we're going to be talking about the two titans of the roguelite genre. In this corner, we have a game considered to be one of the best of all time, Dead Cells, which is just an absolute powerhouse. But there's a new contender in Hades, which has just left early access last month and is just knocking it right out of the park. So, how does Dead Cells compare to Hades? And if you're right now rushing to the keyboard to tell me how these two games can't be compared for some esoteric reason, that's kind of the point. I'm not trying to compare two very similar games, but instead it's a chance to look at what makes each of these popular games different and perhaps figure out which is the best for you or the one you should try next. Feel free to make up your own mind as we go, and I'm going to be honest, I'm not judging this based on who takes the most categories. I won't be making a firm proclamation because I really can't. These two games are both freaking good, and while I like stuff, you may not like the same things. I am going to be breaking down these games into 5 categories, and we're going to be starting with graphics. Normally I don't cover graphics because honestly they're subjective and I don't believe they are truly important to a great game, but Hades and Dead Cells have major differences. Dead Cells is a 2D platformer with a focus on close combat where you get to see highly detailed character models. Simply put, Dead Cells looks great. There's also a lot of different characters, levels, biomes here. Dead Cells has over 70 unique enemies, and except for a couple flies, each enemy has a different design. There's over 20 biomes, which players will progress through, and each feels like a new area with its own selection of enemies that actually fits in with the theme. So what about Hades? Hades, on the other hand, is a isometric 3D dungeon crawler. If you know Supergiant's previous games of Bastion and Transistor, you kind of know this look, but the art is brand new. I actually will applaud Supergiant for returning to kind of the same style of game that they've been doing, and somehow getting a fourth game that looks and feels brand new to the formula. Hades is a little bit smaller, having half the enemy selection, and while it has beautiful areas, there's only about 4 themed areas in the game, along with the House of Hades itself and a few special locations. A little side note, I'm going to be keeping myself to mostly the first 3 locations in Hades, and also about the first third of Dead Cells. There's also gods and characters in Hades, and that's where Hades really shines. The 2D characters here are beautifully drawn and look incredible, but they amount to cutscenes. The enemies all look great and are well animated, but there's not as much in the game. Part of that could be due to the fact that Dead Cells actually started in early access over 3 years ago and has really grown, but I can't imagine Hades will ever have the same variety of locations and enemy types, though honestly I would enjoy that just as much. Truthfully though, this is purely aesthetic, but check both of these games out as we go because I like the look of both titles, though in my mind I think it's clear Dead Cells has a firm, but subjective lead here. So let's talk about how each game plays out, and truthfully, they're both the same. Hit enemies a lot, don't get hit. Almost every game has that rule, of course. They both have a very good dodge system to avoid damage, and pattern recognition is the name of the game. The goal of both games is to fight through levels of enemies and beat a final boss. That doesn't change much. I could also point out that Dead Cells has a health potion system similar to the Estus Flask, where Hades doesn't, but really, the point is at the end of the day, the gameplay here is similar. But both Hades and Dead Cells have a key feature that make them stand out quite a bit, so let's put those head to head. For Hades, we have a story. Hades is based on the Greek gods, of course. The main character is the son of Hades, Zagreus, who is trying to escape. Of course, his father isn't going to allow this. In addition, the House of Hades has a huge court including many famous characters such as Nyx, Cerberus, and Achilles, as well as a ton more who will eventually show up. There's also the more famous gods that appear throughout the game, such as Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, and more. And everyone in Hades talks. You can't meet or run into someone without some dialogue being said, and for the most part, it's a very enjoyable story. Everything is told in snippets, though, with most exchanges taking between 1 and 3 statements, but it's also a story that will continue to show up for as long as you play. Around 50 hours in, I'm still amazed that I don't feel like the story is repeating itself, and it's often referring to what's going on in a current run rather than just random facts that they want to throw at me. If you're a fan of the Greek gods, you're going to fall in love with Hades, and if you always wanted a roguelite where you can learn a little more about the characters you see, Hades is it. There's a lot of deep and complex stories in Hades, and this actually does sit on the Greek pantheon of gods, but it doesn't rehash those stories. It feels like it's a fresh experience. As for Dead Cells, well, people call this a Metroidvania roguelite, and honestly, I kind of hate that idea, because roguelites and Metroidvanias are far different games, and each genre works against each other. It's one thing when Dark Souls has players exploring an area, finding keys, and opening up new paths, but Dead Cells does this while also restarting the game for each new run. That would be pretty painful in any Metroidvania or Souls game. The multiple biomes I mentioned earlier are found by players using abilities to reach new areas. That sounds pretty good. However, to get those abilities, which are acting like keys for those areas, players are going to have to chase down new abilities from different areas. The idea here is similar to Metroidvanias, where the player has to venture off the well-worn path to get a new ability, but the problem is, it doesn't really feel right. Within 10 to 20 hours, you're going to unlock all the biomes, and then Dead Cells really has nothing to do with Metroidvanias. The abilities and keys are an interesting concept, but it's only a momentary system in the game likely made to show people to use different paths. Now, personally, I like Hades' story, but that's of course a very subjective thing, as I'll sometimes hammer through it as I get pumped up for a major fight or just to get back to the game. Whereas Dead Cells' feeling of a Metroidvania is not a huge negative, but it feels like the first 10 hours is a false game that it can't hold up to past that point. Not that Dead Cells is bad here, but it's almost like it's a marketing gimmick. So, I'm going to give this one to Hades, especially because of the length and depth of some of these story segments. The dev team also really listens to fans' feedbacks. I love having characters respond to what you're doing rather than just reciting those random lines. Moving on to the next big difference, and that's going to be weapon selection. This is a rather large difference between these two games. The question is, how do you choose your weapon for a run? Dead Cells has a more traditional roguelite style. As the player enters the dungeon for the first time, he gets a standard weapon, but over time they'll actually get the ability to get a random melee, ranged, and shield item. Though you can only take 2 of these items due to inventory space in the game. From there, random weapons will be found in the dungeon, including traps, power-ups, and more. Players will also want to look for scrolls to power up their weapons, with each scroll powering up one of 3 styles, with weapons being attributed to one of the 3 or more. But weapons are a bit scarce here, and Dead Cells has a different system at the core here as well. Over time, players will unlock more and more weapons, and that means the weapon choice will grow, and the pools that players will be searching through for their favorite weapons will be deeper. But if you want that favorite weapon, such as the ice bow, the more ranged weapons you get means the more you're going to have to dig through as those pop up. Now, most games would have several equally useful weapons, but the thing is, I do think there are significant power tiers to Dead Cells' weapon selection, and suddenly the question becomes which weapon should a player unlock. Part of the issue is that certain weapons favor certain playstyles, such as the Frantic Sword, which requires players to keep a low level of HP for higher damage. Now, if that's not for you, then maybe leave it locked, but of course you can't really tell that until you try out that weapon, which means you have to unlock it. That's really not a satisfying answer, though. Now, there is a custom mode designed to solve this for Dead Cells, but locking off achievements if you limit the weapon choice kind of sucks as well, and it shows that this is not the intended way to play Dead Cells. In general, though, I just hate the idea that players are getting penalized for trying out new weapons or unlocking new weapons. Hades is a bit different. In Hades, the game starts with the player limited to a default sword, though it is a little more powerful, and then needs to unlock additional weapons such as the bow, shield, and spear. Now, each of those unlocks will come with keys earned as the players are going through runs in the dungeon, and eventually you will unlock 6 weapons. Hades is far more limited in its weapon selection, but each weapon also contains what are known as aspects. Aspects are really just minor changes to the weapon, such as allowing the bow to mark enemies with normal attacks, and then letting this special attack hone in on those marked enemies. But aspects are really just little flavors of weapons rather than entirely new gear. At least they are until you get to the hidden aspects, which each of the 6 weapons have one, and without spoiling them, each of those feels like a very unique version of the weapon. Similar design, but you have to tackle the game a little bit differently. Though there are only 6 weapons, there's also a rather robust upgrade system that comes from the different boons that gods give you and the hammer upgrades that you will earn throughout each run. This is where much of the replayability of Hades comes in, with a random selection of which gods and boons become the major changes that happen in each playthrough. You can also just keep applying new boons to your character throughout a run, but in the end they all go away. There are permanent upgrades in the form of a mirror that will allow you to upgrade specific features, but these are always positive, and similar to the aspects, they can be changed or even turned off completely by resetting them. And this is probably going to be the most contentious point, at least until the next one. You can decide for yourself whether you like a large but random pool or a shorter list that you're able to choose. Personally, I hate the idea of an always growing pool of weapons. It's just something I don't find that interesting. The large pool is perfectly fine in games like Rogue and NetHack, but buying weapons that require you adding them to the pool and not giving a way to remove weaker choices that you don't want to see anymore really isn't something that I love. I feel that acquiring new weapons in Dead Cells is a potential hazard, and that makes the player too hesitant to experiment, though the multiple save files can help with that. I mean, just personally, I prefer the Hades selection, especially because I really like the weapons that they have on display there. Now for our fourth category, let's talk about difficulty, and I'm going to have to bring this up. The difficulty in these two games is quite different. I've actually seen people say that they're equally hardcore or difficult. No way. I enjoy both Hades and Dead Cells, but only one of these games really feels like a reference to a certain franchise of the Souls variety. Hades is a challenging game that starts with the player having very limited power. As mentioned, they'll only have the sword available but no upgrades on the mirror, and it'll take players a decent number of runs to start unlocking more ways to play the game, as well as learning the system. But around run 25 or so, players will start beating the game, and once that dam broke for me, I started beating the game regularly, like maybe half the time, with different weapons and loadouts. After beating the game, Hades also has a difficulty system that's called the Pact of Punishment, and these add new twists to the formula. Players do have to take a certain amount of these packs to earn new rewards, but the packs are optional challenges. So if you want to have more enemies, stronger enemies, or even shops costing more money, all of these will raise the difficulty level, but your choice about which system you're going to use is completely up to yourself. This is a very incremental style of difficulty where you have to pick and choose the challenge that you're going to face next time. Now, if you do struggle with the game, you can also play what is known as God Mode, where the player is going to get damage reduction that actually will rise each time you fail. Though, if you also want a harder challenge, Hades has a Hell Mode, which starts the game off with extra difficulty in the form of some specific packs. I admit I haven't played that mode, but it would definitely make the game decently harder. On the other hand, Dead Cells is hard. I would actually say very hard, perhaps one of the hardest roguelites I have ever played. Dead Cells is much more focused on Twitch gameplay, whereas Hades kind of lavishes the player with invincibility frames at times. Enemies have very different strategies, and if you're not leveled up well, you can get killed in a couple of hits in later areas. There's also health potions and such, but outside of those health potions, there's only a couple of improvements that make the game easier, and many of them are weapons and items that will be placed in those larger weapon pools we mentioned earlier. I actually think the name Dead Cells is a bit of an allusion to Dark Souls, though obviously not a direct reference. I find Dead Cells to be very similar in enough ways to make that comparison. Dead Cells will challenge you as a gamer. It's a little easier than you might expect with that comparison, of course, but also remember, if you die, you lose everything and start over with only a few minor upgrades carrying over between runs. And then there are the extra difficulties. Similar to Hades, the game does get harder after you beat it, but where Hades has optional challenges that you're selecting, Dead Cells has what are known as boss cells. Really, boss cells are kind of a difficulty setting. You start on normal, the first one is hard, you go to very hard, and so on. You actually will get less chances to restore your health potions, different enemies, and a few other changes along with additional rooms that you can go to. You choose all these changes or none, and just losing out on the health restores, for instance, is a huge change. But really, Dead Cells gets extremely hard. If you want a real challenge, this is going to be your roguelite. There's also no easy mode for Dead Cells, and personally, I wouldn't mind one so I could actually see more of the content. This game is brutally hard at times. So, which of these games is better? Well, this is going to be the most subjective category, but also the easiest to choose as well. Do you want a challenging game that will be made easier and you'll definitely overcome it at some point, or do you want a brutally hard game that few people will beat? Personally, I'm going to go with Hades. I've conquered both games, but the incremental difficulty in Hades has made me fall in love with that system, whereas Dead Cells really feels like it's creating a new cliff for me to struggle against. This, though, is probably the most important point because I know people love Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Hollow Knight for the challenge they present, and while you can create and find hard challenges in Hades, I honestly think Dead Cells will always be the more difficult game. So now there's one final category, longevity. Listen, both of these games are roguelites. You're probably not going to be beating any of these games in the first run or 10th run, but the idea of a roguelite is to keep playing and one day you might beat it. I honestly know I'm still praying that will happen on NetHack, but what about Hades and Dead Cells? Which of these games will keep you entertained longer? Now, Dead Cells is packed with content. If you're someone who wants to collect everything, Dead Cells is going to keep you very busy. Not only is there a high number of items to find, but you also have to unlock them by playing the game and spending cells. And you earn the currency of cells just by killing enemies, and you'll spend a decent amount of time hunting for those blueprints to get the ability to purchase everything. That's just the inventory itself. I've talked about the challenge of the game, and a lot of the challenge comes from learning and mastering Dead Cells combat as well as every enemy you see. People are talking like a bare minimum of maybe 100 hours or so just to beat the second boss cell. And again, that's like the third level of difficulty. There's actually 5 potential boss cells that you can have. There's also different biomes, which each have different enemies and challenges. If you stick to the main path, you're actually talking about a third of the game or so, but there's so many other paths to explore. Now, as for Hades, there's a lot of content in Hades, and you're going to consistently be making progress throughout it. Even harder difficulties may not challenge you as much. There's also a question of how far you're going to go. Now, getting every achievement in Hades will take some time, as most of them will require you running the game many times. There is also an epilogue in which you're going to have to grind out relationship levels with some characters. If you're just going for all the achievements in the game, you're probably going to earn that in under 100 hours. There will still be tons to do to keep going to higher difficulty levels, but many of them are not required for the achievements themselves. Essentially, there is a soft limit to the content here. You can always chase additional power and difficulty so that you can beat those higher difficulty levels, but it's really not unlocking anything too new at that point. So if you were stuck on a desert island and had to choose one of these games, I'd honestly probably pick Dead Cells. You're going to need more time to unlock everything, and there's tons of content for you to chase. Whereas in Hades, there's a ton of content, but much of the later unlocks are minor changes to the look of the place, and while I definitely would recommend spending more time than just the achievements in it, it doesn't have the longevity that Dead Cells will have. Though realize neither of these games is lacking in content, and both games will get you your money's worth. We're talking about like $20, $25 games, so you really don't have to worry. So those are the 5 categories I've gone over: graphics, the special feature, weapon selection, difficulty, and longevity. So all that's left to do is to crown a victor. Now, as I said, this is a very subjective topic because for every reason I like Hades or Dead Cells, someone else could prefer the other game. But one of these games made me drop a ton of hours into it. I spent multiple nights playing it instead of making videos, writing, or just playing what I was planning to play or had to play. Even recording footage for this game was challenging because I got sidetracked. This last month actually has been less productive than others, and the reason for that is Hades. Hades is an amazingly addictive game, and I can't stop playing it. I actually have had to stop picking it up for just one game, because it's never just one game. And on screen, I'm flipping through all the pictures of my wins because I feel proud of these accomplishments. That's not to say Dead Cells has not given me sleepless nights or a sense of accomplishment, but personally, I just haven't fallen for Dead Cells as much as other people. I absolutely love Metroidvanias, I love Roguelites, and Dead Cells is incredible. It just hasn't grabbed me in the same way. To paraphrase Jeremy Clarkson, Dead Cells is brilliant, but I like Hades. So there you have it. What do you all think? Are you Hades fans, Dead Cell fans, both, or do you just dislike roguelites in general? Are there any other important differences I should have mentioned between these two, or what other recent roguelites should I cover? And this video was born out of a necessity to cover Hades, but also a desire to talk about Dead Cells, and I knew if I talked about one of them, I probably wouldn't talk about the other one too quickly. Both of these games are highly addictive, and I feel that I should cover both of them as I started playing both of them this year. If you want to see more head-to-heads, though, let me know. I find this interesting because rather than look at one game, it's more interesting to compare and contrast it with another game, even if it is dissimilar. Kind of like how I looked at Void Bastards and Rogue Legacy earlier this year. Anyways, you know the spiel and how YouTube works. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and comments do help out the channel. I really appreciate it all. Do what you feel is right, and I hope I've entertained you enough for any of that. But if you do know anyone who's considering either Dead Cells or Hades, please feel free to share this video with them. I'll pop up that old video on Void Bastards here as well, and I'm also going to be throwing up a video from 2 weeks ago where I tear down a quest in Disco Elysium. If you like RPGs with a heavy focus on dialogue, trust me, you're going to want to check that game out. Until then, I'm King Lincoln. Thank you for watching.